Welcome to Issues and Answers with your host, Diane. Issues and Answers is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. And now, Issues and Answers with your host, Diane.
Welcome to the program. I'm Diane Kinderwater. It's time to think back. It's time to put on that thinking cap and go back in time. Can you go back 6 decades? I'm not going to say if I can or not, but can you remember what happened 6 decades ago, October 1962? Maybe when you were a kid, were you hiding under your desk at school? Did you even know why you were doing that? Did you know that we were at the brink of World War III, that there was a possibility that literally the whole world could blow up? Well, on the show today, we're going to discuss the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis from October 1962 when it ended. We're going to go back in time. We're going to look back at that time, and we're going to refresh our memory of what was happening in our lives. If you're pretty young, I bet, to remember what was happening, or perhaps you studied it in school, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to talk about how it relates to what's going on today with Ukraine and Russia. We're also going to give you information about a book, Armageddon's Angel, which is a thriller relating to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also talk about Los Alamos. Now, my guest today has information that I hadn't heard about, maybe you had, but of course, Los Alamos' involvement with the atomic bomb, we in New Mexico certainly know about that, but what about Geiger counters that were on fishing boats next to Russian ships around the Caribbean that were developed at Los Alamos? Did you know about that? And how about this revelation? It's a bombshell revelation that our guest is going to tell us about why complete annihilation of our world did not happen in October 1962. He's going to tell us how it was avoided. So this is pretty thrilling. This is not fiction. This is real life stuff. So please stay with us as we talk to Dr. Alan Deihl. He's a former U.S. government investigator, and he's got news that's new to all of us, so stay with us. Okay, perhaps you're going to hear it first here. Why was the annihilation of our world avoided? Why was World War III back in 1962 avoided? Of course, we're hoping, crossing our fingers and praying that we don't have a World War III because of Putin and Russia and Ukraine. But my guest today, Dr. Alan Deihl, who is a former U.S. government investigator, not only wrote this book, this thriller, but which is fiction. Fiction. We're going to talk about some nonfiction things, and we're going to go back in time. The 60th anniversary was just recently this fall. The 60th anniversary of the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, Dr. Deihl, let's go back in time and slowly, let's start with why was there even a missile crisis to begin with?
Well, of course, it was the height of the Cold War. 1962, Kennedy had just been elected a year ago, and he oversaw an invasion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs that turned out to be an absolute disaster. Now, Kennedy took responsibility for that, but the head of the Soviet Union was a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita saw John F. Kennedy as a weak person, a rich boy that didn't understand international geopolitics, if you will. So he created the Berlin crisis. They built the Berlin Wall. We've all read about that. And now Kennedy's back is to the wall, and Khrushchev sees an opportunity to exploit Kennedy.
And even before that, let's go back a little bit in time about Russia after World War II, when we were with Russia fighting Germany. But after World War II, they felt the United States was kind of interventionist, while the Soviet Union in the eastern part of the world was invading or taking over a lot of different countries, kind of like they're trying to do today. So that was the relationship after World War II. That's when the Cold War began, because the United States, of course, we developed the atomic bomb during World War II. But then the Russians started developing atomic bombs, and then we say we're going to have a bigger hydrogen bomb, and that's when the Cold War started with all this bomb building, bombing building, and experimenting. Okay.
Absolutely. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, incidentally, the Soviets knew that we had 17 times as many nukes as they did. So they were trying to level the playing field by bringing the nukes into Cuba.
Yeah, that's the crutch. It was 90 miles from the border of the United States.
Absolutely.
Russia was placing missiles that could target the eastern part of the United States.
Well, actually, some of those missiles could reach virtually the entire country, and they also put some bombers that were capable of aircraft that were capable of pretty well hitting the whole nation. And of course, these were huge missiles, and Khrushchev put a general in Havana, and he told that general, the Americans are going to spot these huge intercontinental missiles. Which
we did.
Well, yeah. We had spy planes called U-2s. These flew at 70,000 feet, and on the 13th or 14th of October, they actually photographed the strategic missiles. And Kennedy was told on the 15th, we've got a major problem with dozens of nuclear-capable missiles being located in Cuba.
So this was the crisis back, again, 60 years ago. We're not celebrating, but we're acknowledging the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the height was mid-October.
It was basically from the 15th to the 28th is when Khrushchev, and we'll talk about why, decided, okay.
Well, let's not say what he decided yet. We're going to wait and be a thriller until he decided. But at this point, these U-2 planes saw that they were building these missile silos and places to launch atomic missiles.
Absolutely.
At our country.
The whole country was at risk. There was like 40 of these intercontinental missiles. They were technically called intermediate range missiles.
Do you remember what you did in school? Did you hide under desks at that time?
Oh, yeah.
You were just a kid, but did you personally know what was going on?
Well, as a matter of fact, in the 50s, before your time, Diane, we crawled underneath desks because we knew the Soviets had nuclear missiles and bombers. So it was duck and cover time in the 50s. Well, I'm an Air Force cadet in 1962 during the crisis, and I happened to get a ride into a Tampa Air Base called MacDill, and that's where the attack was planned, and the nuclear bombers were literally sitting there ready to go to war. So I saw the bombers that were surrounded by security people, and my professors that were flying the airplane said, "Al, you're witnessing history, young Mr. Cadet." And I remember that.
The history or the end of the world, right?
Well,
Truly,
it was
everybody
thought the United States Air Force could take out those missiles with our aircraft and our own missiles. But what happened, a couple things happened. One, an Air Force general said, "Mr. Kennedy, we can only guarantee 90% of those missiles." Now, if they've got 40 missiles, that means at least 4 cities in America, 10% of the total will hit American cities. So there goes Washington, there goes Atlanta, there goes Miami, there goes Dallas.
Those are the ones you're just pointing out. So that's where President Kennedy was told only 90%. That probably wasn't acceptable. But going back, Fidel Castro, communist, was in power at that point, and that's where Nikita Khrushchev thought he had an ally with Castro, and again, being 90 miles from our U.S. border, Key West, 90 miles is Cuba. So that's where Kennedy, again going back before the Cuban Missile Crisis, tried to invade, had some nationalists, Cuban nationalists who left the country when Castro took control, came to Miami basically, and then they were planning to reinvade 1,400 of them. That was in April of '62, and that was what was not successful, the Bay of Pigs.
The Bay of Pigs, oh yeah.
That really probably pissed them off even more.
Absolutely. Now that was the other motivation for Khrushchev. He wanted to make sure Kennedy didn't do another Bay of Pigs with more people. Now remember, Kennedy canceled the American air cover for the Bay of Pigs and had to take blame because everybody said had Kennedy authorized airstrikes, the Bay of Pigs would have been successful. But Kennedy decided maybe we shouldn't do that. And of course, he took the blame. He went on national television and said, the Bay of Pigs was my responsibility. And then he went after the CIA, who assured him that those liberators, quote unquote, would be greeted as liberators. And it turns out the Cuban people weren't ready for another dictator, whoever that was that the Americans wanted.
Does that have anything to do now with the United States involvement with the Ukraine? President Biden decided, because of course Russia is invading Ukraine, but President Biden doesn't want us to get into World War III, so he is not involved except monetarily. Our country, our tax dollars, billions of dollars are going to that effort. But is it similar to Kennedy not wanting to have air cover over Cuba?
Exactly.
No involvement.
Biden wouldn't give the Ukrainians airplanes. If you remember that, Lizinski said, we need some airplanes, and Biden said no. And, I guess it was Yogi Berra, the old baseball announcer, that said, reminds me of deja vu all over again. Well, I think to our audience, maybe they're saying it reminds me of deja vu all over again.
With the Bay of Pigs and
the
no
Bay of
air
Pigs,
cover. Okay.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, and now President Putin threatening the world with tactical nuclear weapons use in the Ukraine. And we'll talk about that later. Now, we've talked about the strategic...
A lot of similarities.
Yeah.
So, going back in time, Dr. Deihl, where were we? We were at the Bay of Pigs. That was a fiasco. But now we had the YouTube planes looking over Cuba, flying over Cuba and seeing these missile sites.
Basically, they're telling Kennedy, they've got probably 40 nuclear-tipped missiles that can reach the United States. And the Joint Chiefs, the people that run the Pentagon, the four generals, the Air Force, Navy, Marine, Army generals, unanimously recommended an attack and an invasion. Now, the Air Force general said we can't take out but 90% of the missiles. And I guess the other Army general said, well, we'll drop paratroopers and they'll shoot up the Russian crews. And Kennedy, both Jack and Bobby Kennedy, I guess, were thinking, do we really want to kill a lot of Russians as well as take out their missiles? They're in Berlin right now building a wall. Who knows? They've got more conventional forces in Europe than we do, or that even NATO does. So Kennedy's got his back to the wall, and he's thinking about okay, so now you're saying I could invade and you'd get all the missiles, but we're going to have to kill some Russians. And the plan to do that was taking place partly at the Pentagon, but the final plan was to take place at Tampa, which is now where the Special Operations Command is. It's called McGill Air Force Base. Back then, that's where the final invasion and attack planes
was all being planned.
That was all being planned.
Kind of like a D-Day type, combined with
lots of airstrikes.
Like some airstrikes.
Absolutely. There were 125,000 American troops prepared to go into Cuba. So this was a big deal with a lot of planning.
But it didn't happen.
But it didn't happen. Why?
Well, I don't recall why, but you have new information. Why?
Well,
wait, before we say, we're still holding on. Before we say why it didn't happen, tell me a little bit again about what you found out about Los Alamos' involvement with these Geiger counters and how they were placed on fishing boats next to the Soviet ships. Tell me first, before we say why the invasion didn't happen, but the additional information we got from these Geiger counters developed at Los Alamos.
Well, what happened is Kennedy said, well, how do we know there are really nukes in Cuba? And so the call went, I assume it was either CIA or the Pentagon, got a hold of the Los Alamos people and said, can you build super sensitive Geiger counters? Because the CIA says if we get those super sensitive Geiger counters, We can put them on fishing boats out of the Florida Keys. We'll fly Cuban flags on, so they'll look like Cubans. We'll hire Hispanic crew members to sail the boats, and we'll sail up beside the Russian freighters, and your Geiger counters from Los Alamos will tell us if there's really nukes aboard. And so that's when Kennedy found out, yeah, there are really nukes. Now remember, Khrushchev kept sending more and more and more nukes over there, and we'll talk about this. They weren't just those long-range nukes. He'd also sent 96 tactical nukes, the things that Putin is telling us he's going to use in Ukraine, or he may use in Ukraine. So these are called battlefield nukes. They're small and you can't see them. You can hide them on trucks. They're very small, but that's another story for later in your hour. But so now we're at MacDill, or at least Cadet Alan Deihl is at MacDill, and he's boarding a U.S. Army transport flown by a U.S. Army general and colonel. And after takeoff, they're talking, this was 1963. This is a year after the crisis. And these two senior officers are talking about how we should have taken them out when they were 90 miles away. And now guys like Al Deihl are going to go to Vietnam because they're 9,000 miles away and we're fighting at a disadvantage. But we could have done this a year ago. And the colonel said, well, you know, but it was...
Wait, was that you, Al?
That's Cadet Al Deihl.
Okay.
That was the uniform I was wearing. And of course, now remember, I'm just a cadet, and these guys are very senior officers that had planned the invasion, and they'd been talking. They turned to me and said, Cadet, what kind of security clearance do you have? And I said, General, I have a top secret clearance. And he turned to the colonel and he said, yeah, go ahead and tell him. And what they told me is that the two of them were there to greet an airplane coming from Andrews Air Force Base in Washington with the draft plans. They were going to meet the aircraft, open up the baggage compartment, take the plans into the base, and finish the plan for the attack on Cuba.
So these are two airmen who told you this in 1963, what happened in 1962. And so I'm just helping our viewers understand this is what you were told about why the invasion didn't take place. And some people are saying they wish they would have taken place to end everything in Cuba rather than in Vietnam, which was just beginning. So this is information you personally learned about why the invasion actually, why the
invasion, yeah, an attack didn't occur.
The attack, the bombings, and also the troops on the ground. Why? Because Kennedy chose a blockade. Later. But why the invasion did not happen, well, is what you found out.
Kennedy thought the troops and the airplanes would be ready in a couple days. That's what he had been told, and that's what to do the invasion. The Pentagon had bombing. Yeah, the commanders, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had urged him to, before they get any more of these nukes, because they're coming. Los Alamos is telling them they're coming across in the freighters, and so they're trying to push him into this invasion and attack. And these two officers are there to meet the airplane, take the draft plans, and come up with the final plan. And when they come out and meet, this is at night, they're telling me, we put our flashlights on the baggage compartment and the door is open. Of course, they ran over and asked the pilot, when did the door come open? He didn't know the door was open. The plans were gone. So now the plans, the super secret, beyond top secret plans for the invasion and attack on Cuba are missing somewhere between Washington and Tampa, and nobody knows where they're at. So of course they looked around the airport, they looked around Andrews Air Force Base when the plane departed. They can't find it.
So the paper plans were lost.
They were gone.
They were gone.
So now...
the plans that Kennedy was going to use to invade Cuba.
Exactly. But of course, Kennedy doesn't know they're lost, and these officers probably don't want to pick up the phone and say, Mr. President. But anyway, what they did is they told Kennedy and the Pentagon and the CIA, look, we're not ready to go. We told you we'd be ready in a couple days, but you're going to have to wait a while. Now, Kennedy, of course, knows more and more nukes are coming in because of the Los Alamos Geiger counters. And he's beginning to get nervous, okay? And he finally against the recommendation of his military chiefs, says, let me think about this. And then he came back and said, I've decided we're going to go on a naval blockade rather than an attack.
So he was, because you've told me, I'm not saying this myself, because these plans were lost in transit, plans that President Kennedy needed if he were to choose to invade were lost, he was given time to kind of rethink his strategy.
Exactly.
So you're saying that he had more time to contemplate another avenue rather than possibly going into World War III.
Well, you know, and there's another little funny part to this.
Well, don't stay out with that part. Stay at that part.
That's true. What you said is absolutely correct, Diane.
But I learned this from you. I never heard it from anybody else.
That's right. And probably other than those, well, the officers that were at MacDill, I'm sure these two officers told other officers, we've got to redo everything, because you see the landing zones for the paratroopers were in those plans. The beaches that the Marines were planning on invading, the amphibious landings, were in those plans. And now that airplane, that jet that had the baggage compartment open up, overflew a place called Ybor City in Tampa, which is the second biggest Cuban community in the United States. And I think one of the officers said to me, how do we know those plans didn't end up in Ybor City and they're on their way to Havana? What if there's a Castro sympathizer that finds these plans and, you know, takes them back to Cuba, and now they know where the 82nd and 101st Airborne are going to parachute in? They could annihilate. You know, this happened in World War II. A lot of paratroopers got killed in D-Day, so that's why they had to delay this, and it gave Kennedy some breathing room to rethink this, and he decided to go. He called it an embargo because blockade is an act of war. So anyway, that's...
So he embargoed instead of...
quarantine. I'm sorry, I said embargo. Quarantine is the word that they officially used to stop the nukes from coming in. So he said, we're going to put a quarantine.
Quarantine on the island with naval ships, our naval ships, stopping the Russian freighters.
Freighters, yeah.
So we had the authority or the ability to quarantine that island?
No, not by international law, but that was less risky than parachuting in and killing a bunch of Russian missile crews and bombing their aircraft and probably their facilities and their missiles.
We had a newspaper article, I think it was from England, that called it a blockade.
Yeah, but it was a blockade, which is technically illegal. So he called it an embargo, I think was the word.
And an ultimatum to Khrushchev, move those missiles. So we blockade, and Kennedy, instead of bombing or having paratroopers, had the blockade, the quarantine, and what did Khrushchev do?
Well, at that time...
we only have a few minutes left, Al.
All right. Well, we were still flying U-2 flights over the spy planes over the island, and without authorization, a Russian missile crew, a Soviet missile crew, shot down and U-2 at 70,000 feet, killed the pilots. And of course, when that happened, the American military immediately wanted to retaliate. They wanted to blow up all the Soviet anti-aircraft missiles. And Khrushchev was told this happened, and he said, I didn't authorize anybody to shoot down a spy plane. And he realized, I've lost control. And it was at that point that he decided, we better cut our losses and get out of there, kind of like Vladimir Putin appears to be doing, at least in eastern Ukraine right now. So 2 years later, Khrushchev was replaced by his Soviet comrades, and I'm sure that must be on the mind of Vladimir Putin. So, you know, the deja vu all over again.
But Khrushchev said they didn't end the Cold War, but it lessened it to a great impact.
Exactly.
In October of 1962, because Khrushchev did what?
He agreed to if Kennedy would lift the blockade and promise never to do an invasion of Cuba, I'll take all the nukes out of Cuba. And Kennedy looked like he was a brilliant leader. Now, he also demanded we took our missiles out of Turkey, which are threatening Cuba, the Soviet Union, like the missiles in Cuba would have threatened us. So there was a quid pro quo, but that part was kept secret because Kennedy didn't want it announced before the November election. Remember, this is October. He's facing, or his congressmen are facing re-election, so he didn't want to seem like he caved into the Russians. He wanted it to look like he had negotiated a good settlement from America's standpoint.
But you're saying the bombshell revelation was these plans were lost because that Kennedy could not react as fast as he could have if he chose. But he chose instead to take a breather and to have the blockade or the quarantine.
Absolutely. That saved the world, basically. There's more to that story that we'll talk about later because there was more than just those strategic nukes in Cuba. They were tactical nukes that we didn't know about under the control of junior Russian officers. Khrushchev did not have control over the tactical nukes. These Russian lieutenants and captains literally had control over these battlefield nukes, and they could have killed 18,000 Marines at Guantanamo had they chosen or had they thought the attack was starting. So that's another story that's never been fully told. We didn't learn that till after the Cold War ended, and the former Soviets said,
And when did the Cold War end?
At 91. In 92, they had a conference and they said, it's a good thing you didn't invade because in addition to those strategic missiles, we had 96 tactical nukes that would have just slaughtered your paratroopers and
Al,
Marines.
you brought us new information. We went back in time as we acknowledged the 60th anniversary of the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have this thriller, Armageddon's Angels, that we'll talk about in another program that you wrote. Cuban Missile Crisis thriller, based on some things you've learned, but it is a fiction book.
It's inspired by real events, as they like to say. But it is a novel.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Deihl, for all the information and all the work you've done in our country. Appreciate that. And thank you for watching this program. I told you it was going to be a thriller. I'm Diane Kinderwater. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Issues and Answers with your host Diane Kinderwater is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. To comment on today's program or to purchase a copy of any Issues and Answers program, visit sunbroadcasting.org or call us at 505-345-1991.